Remington Podcast, where we take a deep dive into all things ammunition. I'm your host, Audrey Mays, and today I'm sitting down with Head of Research and Development, Jon Langenfeld.
Happy to be here.
We're going to talk to you guys about powder. Powder is a huge component of every cartridge, and a lot of handloaders and reloaders out there need to know a little bit about it. So I think the first thing I want to get, you research and development, right? So the first question I have for you is, how do you select a powder for a cartridge?
Well, it really depends on what you're trying to do from a system requirement. That's what we call it internally. Every cartridge shot shell is going to have a range of powders that work with it to have safe pressures. But at the end of the day, we select those propellants to achieve a particular goal. Mm-hmm. So what velocity do you want the bullet to go? And based on those parameters, we go in and select a range of propellants to evaluate that will give us what we would consider optimum performance.
And basically the way that powder affects velocity is that it just builds pressure, right?
100%. Yep. Mm-hmm. So the range of propellants burn faster or slower. Okay. That's the terms that we use. And it's really about how quickly that propellant will reach the peak pressure. Okay. And from there, it's going to build that pressure behind the projectile, whether it's a shot payload in a wad or a bullet. And then that will give you your end result of what the velocity is. Mm-hmm. That's what we call, P&V, pressure and velocity.
Mm-hmm. So as it's burning, it's building up pressure in this case. Then as soon as the projectile takes off, that's the release, right? So that's the peak and drop?
No. So you can reach peak pressure before the projectile exits the barrel. Okay. It can still be pressurized, but you may reach the peak pressure before that. Mm-hmm. But yeah, you're 100% correct in the fact that the primer ignites the propellant, starts to burn, builds pressure behind the bullet. So just like any escape valve, so to speak, when you have pressure that's building, the first place it's going to go is the easiest place to release it. Well, when you have a bullet or a shot or payload that can move, it's going to start moving. And as that pressure builds behind it, then that's, it's going to send the bullet or whatever down the barrel. Mm-hmm.
And different powders burn differently, essentially.
Yep. Think of it as, like I said, as speed. If you were to, I don't know if you've ever ignited black powder, light it on fire and it's just poof and it's gone. Right. Versus something that you would light and it burns. Mm-hmm. It's slower. And so, when that ignition happens with the primer, it's going to reach pressure sooner or later, and that's really what, pressure time curves. And so how quickly does it reach that max pressure versus how slow, and the chemistry of the powder, how it's made up, deterrents and things like that are on it, is going to control, what we call in the relative term of, is it fast or is it slow? Right.
Why are there so many different kinds of powders? When you walk into, any store that sells powders, I'm overwhelmed by how many are on the shelf. So why are there so many different kinds?
Well, there's a lot of manufacturers, for one, just like with anything. Why is there so many different brands of cars? So there's different manufacturers. Mm-hmm. They have different processes, which, if people have ever looked at propellants, is why you would see some that they look different. Right. They have different shapes, stick or flake, very spherical, it's very flat, kind of a wafer. And then, generalized as ball powder. It can be in slightly different shapes. But so different manufacturing processes, different manufacturers, and then even within a brand or a manufacturer, a propellant, they're going to generate that spectrum of speed, fast to slow, so that you can load all the different types of cartridges that we have. Okay. Because you've got handgun propellants, and there's some overlap, a little overlap, where you can put shot shell. And handgun, you can use some of the same. Uh-huh. And then you've got, some rifle cartridges that, depending on their efficiency, if they're what I call overboard. So think of a big magnum, something that has a big case and it's constricted down. So it just, steep shouldered, and it's really neck down. So something like a 7mm Ultra Magnum, for example, you're going to need a really slow burning powder because you have a really big case and a small hole. Versus if you took, let's just say you make that bigger. So compare it to a 375 Ultra Magnum. So it's the same size case, but a bigger bullet.
Yeah.
It doesn't throttle it back so much. Think of like a funnel. You've really got to get all this powder through this funnel. Where if I open that hole up, now the way that the powder burns in the shell and the way that it reaches pressure, you don't need a powder that's as slow of burning. You can go a little faster, and so
because the relief valve is bigger.
Essentially, yeah, yep. That's the way to think about it. You're building that pressure up, and how much force it takes to get that bullet going the speed you want. You start to dial in what range of propellants you need to get the pressure, and then the velocity. So if you take and put a really slow powder in something that doesn't need a powder that slow, you're more than likely you're just going to fill the case up. You're going to be out of room because you're not building enough pressure, and your bullet's not going to go as fast as you want it to go.
Right.
So you use a faster powder that there's the optimum range of good case fill, pressure and velocity, and this is what we'd call really good performance. But if you go faster yet, you're going to start to hit pressure before you get the velocity, and so you're also going to have less case fill. So though you've got more energetic in the slow, it just, like I said, it doesn't build up quick enough. But if you go too quick, then essentially it's over and done before you're able to get it up to speed. It's just too much pressure.
And what happens when there is too much pressure? Will your case split or something?
Well, it can.
Okay.
And every platform's different. So if you're just talking like center fire rifle, if all the reloading manuals, if you go through those, they usually have indicators that you're looking for. What are signs of pressure? And there's data in there that says here's the safe limits, because all that data is generated in a lab where they can measure velocity and pressure. But signs of pressure, as you start to get up, things that become, the first signs would be like loose primer pockets, flattened primers, sticky bolt lift on a bolt action, where it's, everybody knows how a bolt gun feels. Well, if it starts to get, like I said, it's just a little more resistance.
Hard to turn over.
You're starting to build up in pressure.
Okay.
And all the way to, the case can't contain it anymore, and you can have case head separation. You can have primer leaks, all the way into, catastrophic failures to where the gun can't contain the pressure.
That would have to be pretty intense, I would assume.
Yeah. Well, firearms are tested with proof loads that are well and above a pressure range of service ammunition. So there's a big factor of safety in there. But, occasionally you see things online where accidents happen and an individual uses the wrong propellant and it just can't contain it. And, it's going to go up.
Label your propellants.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. And really understand what you're doing. Make sure that's the powder jug. Don't be distracted when you're doing it. Things like that, because, like I said, it's not common. I know a lot of reloaders that have never had any issues. But if you follow the rules, use your reloading manuals.
Use the recipe.
Yeah, you'll be fine.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's. I think at first people feel like it's a little overwhelming, and like, oh my gosh, I don't know that I want to do this. This could be dangerous, that sort of thing. But I've been doing it a long time, and maybe that's why I don't feel like it's overwhelming.
You get a little comfortable,
but that's why there's so much content out there with powder manufacturers and bullet manufacturers and data. And if you do those things, then that's why they've generated that data in the lab.
Yeah, people really do their due diligence. But so you going back, you said that, let's say I want to load like a 22-250 and I also want to load like, I don't know, a 300 rum or something. I can't or shouldn't use the same powder in those?
So if you go to the reloading manual, you're going to see that they're going to be in two different burn speed categories.
Okay, yeah.
And the reason is how the pressure builds. 22-250s, they're just in a different category, different burn speed range. And so just because a cartridge is bigger and smaller, it's not necessarily that you can't use those same powders. So, I've got a 375 H&H and a 416 Remington, and there's overlap with the powders in those that go in also into a 22-250, and they're completely different sizes.
Right.
But you get down to, say, 300 Ultra Magnum, and now you need something that's much slower because it's neck down more. And it's like what we talked about earlier. So it's all about the pressure.
Would you call that a pinch point? Like there's more of a pinch point or not necessarily?
You could. Okay. Yeah, you could. Absolutely. It's the restriction, so to speak. Yeah. They use the term overboard in the industry, which is, think of a straight wall, think of a 4570, fairly efficient. It's just straight. If you start to neck that down, you're starting to create a restriction, and you're going to have to funnel the powder through that. And the more you do it, the slower the propellant is going to have to be so that you don't get too much pressure.
And so is that like technically the argument between straight walls being like the slower cartridge?
No, it has nothing to do with it.
Okay,
nope.
Never mind then. So someone who shoots something that needs, every round to be exactly the same, someone like a PRS shooter or something, what cautions do they have to take that maybe a hunter who shoots 3 rounds a year doesn't have to do?
Well, consistency, distance. If you're looking at 6, 7, 800,000 yards, you've got to have something that's going to have minimal velocity variation so that you can minimize that vertical dispersion. So when if they're not all going to be exactly the same speed, but you want them as close as you can get them, because the drop would be different as they change in velocity. So when you're looking at how do I put something together that's going to be consistent, and we're not going to get into case prep and annealing and all that kind of stuff. We'll just assume that that's all equal, and of good quality. You can change your propellant and primer combination, and you're going to have to, as a consumer, you're going to have a chronograph. You're going to have a radar. You're going to have something to actually know how consistent it is. And from there, you can figure out, well, how big of a target am I going to shoot? And that's going to determine how minimal variation you have to have. Otherwise, you'll miss the target.
Right.
If it's too much. And so if you don't see the results that you're looking for, and, you're annealing and everything else in your case prep is good, because that has a big effect on it as well, you can change propellants and change powder combinations, primer combination, and you can have different results because the chemistry in the primers is different. The quantity of the primer mix is different.
Right.
And vice versa. The chemistry with the powder is also different, with ball or stick or the speed or whatever. So those are things that we look at in here based on the system requirements of, is it a hunting cartridge? Is it a long range cartridge? Does it have to have very, low standard deviations of velocity? Temperature requirements, are you using them in an extreme temperature conditions? And some propellants are more temperature stable than others, and others are more influenced, in hotter conditions. Things typically go up, in cold conditions they go down. But I would say that, over the last probably 5 to 10 years, I've seen big advancements in propellant technology, that there's a lot of really good powders out there that makes our jobs a lot easier when we test at those extreme conditions, and you don't see the big swings
and anymore. I mean, you've been in the industry
almost 14 years,
right? So you've seen kind of like the progression.
Oh yeah, 100%.
Yeah, that's really cool. So going back, you did say that my primer selection could affect my powder.
Yep.
Performance.
Yep, absolutely. The chemistry of the primer. So everybody's primers are different. We do them differently. Our primers versus either sister companies or competitors. They're different.
Yeah.
We have different blends and quantity, in it. And so that's going to affect the output, which is that initial ignition source, different size flame, different, they call it bursants, which is like think of it just kind of like a little explosion, how much gas, how much force that it's getting hit with. And, that's going to control how consistently that propellant burns based on its speed. Typically a large quantity of really slow burning powder, it needs a bigger flame. It needs more to get it going and consistently than something that is of a faster speed and lower quantity. You don't need as much. And so you can, and there's some middle ground in areas where you can use both what they would call a standard and a magnum primer. And you may see slightly better performance with one or the other, depending on the burn speed of your powder. So those are variables that you can tweak, depending on what your end goal is.
Right.
And so if you're chronographing and you're looking for a particular, standard deviation in your velocity, you can change those things and see if they're making a difference that, is important to you.
Mm-hmm.
But, you're the hunter that's using a couple rounds a year and things like that, shooting 300 yards or less, he can get away with more variation than a guy that's trying to shoot a small target at 1,000 yards.
Right. In powders, slower doesn't necessarily mean better. Faster doesn't necessarily mean. It's all about what you're trying to do.
Yep. What cartridge you're putting it in and generating a safe pressure.
Mm-hmm.
That's the most important. But there's that optimum range where you want to be so that you have good case fill, that you're getting enough out of the cartridge. So if I take a 300 Winchester Magnum and I put in a real fast powder, it may not be any better performance than a 30-06.
Okay.
And so at that point, why don't I just go get a 30-06?
Mm-hmm.
So if I use the right powder, now I'm actually going to see the velocity gain because I've got a bigger case. So that's where you're trying to find what's the optimum powder. And then as well, you can get the consistency with changing slightly within those burn speeds. That's just part of it. Usually you'll get a family of propellants for a cartridge.
That you can choose from.
And you try them. And you see, does this one shoot good for me? And it may work with different bullets. So as a hand loader, in my personal life, if I go pick bullet A, I may have 3 propellants I want to try. One of those may be more consistent with that primer. The accuracy may be better. And so you can just tweak it and see. A lot of it's, experimentation,
right.
And development. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. What, can you mix powders?
Ooh, I'm going to say no, don't do that.
Don't do that.
But, powders are blended in manufacturing. And so.
Can you buy blended powders? Like already they market it like that? Not necessarily.
Not really. I mean, you're not going to take powder A and B and go shake and bake them at home and put them together to create this new recipe. Don't do that. That's not good. They're doing that for you.
Right. In the manufacturing process.
They're doing, and that's how you're creating different speeds. And it's more so than just taking 2 different speeds and putting them together. The chemistry is changing. But there have, you could go back and research, different things, but there have been individuals that have put duplex loads together or starter powders, in very large things. There's a very fast burning powder like toward the primer and then a slow one to help with that ignition to burn consistently.
Okay. Like layering powders
almost. Yeah. But that's not common. And again, don't do it at home.
Don't be weird.
But, big military type cartridges. I think I've seen it read before, like in 700 Nitro Express. They were having, 5 to 10 grains of a real fast powder at the bottom and then loading it up with slow, things like that. But, I mean, is it common? No. Does it occur? Yes.
Okay. Yeah. Anything else you want to add about powders?
They're really getting good. Like I said, it's making our life a whole lot easier as a development engineer. And then also for folks, at home, it's the technology and the consistency. I think that in today's world, one of the things that people are starting to see that is really affecting their loads is the moisture content in their propellant.
Yeah.
Testings, there's data out there. We control things internally in specific environments so that we get that consistency. But, you always see like store your ammunition in cool, dry places and things like that. But for those PRS guys, I'm starting to see people paying attention to where they're storing their ammo to the degree that they're putting them in storage containers with humidity packs so that it doesn't change whether they're going from a humid environment to a dry environment to shoot a competition and also conditioning the propellant, trying to keep it consistent. And so for those, for those PRS guys that are reloading out there, they're chasing that single digit,
fraction.
You might look at moisture in your powder.
Interesting. Yeah.
So,
because there would be a huge difference. I mean, even shooting something in Colorado versus shooting something here in Arkansas, just the moisture content in the air.
Sure.
Completely
100%. Or how long that ammunition is allowed to be conditioned in that environment. Because a lot of people think, well, how would it change? It's sealed, right? There's a primer and there's a bullet, but they're not airtight. There's things that you can do to make them airtight with sealants on the primer and around the bullet. But, generally most ammunition is not sealed completely. Like there can still be air changes in there, and those can explain changes that you see in your chronograph that you're like, wow, this was doing this 2 weeks ago, but maybe you've went from 30% to 80% humidity and things like that. So anyways, that's something I'm seeing in the consumer world of reloading and shooting that I don't think people have really paid a lot of attention to.
Yeah. So if you want to up your game, maybe pay a little more attention to that. Yeah. Thanks for the little breakdown. I think that was really good. There you have it, guys. Remington is on the rise. Like, comment, subscribe, and be sure to share this podcast with your hunting or shooting buddies. If you have any questions for me or Jon here, you can email us at podcast@remington.com. Thanks for listening.